Welcome to Integrated Wellbeing YouTube channel and podcast for people in grief and the professionals who serve them. We provide education, inspiration, and practical tools by interviewing those bereaved by loss, mental health professionals, and grief specialists. Integrated Wellbeing Institute seeks to awaken the griever to their inner peace through the guidance of their body. I'm Georgena Grace, and I am delighted today to welcome my colleague, Neil Gordon, communications expert. Hello, Neil.
Good to see you, Georgena.
Oh, it's wonderful to have you here today. And I don't usually do this for my audience, Neil, but I want them to hear about your unique background. Before we start our discussion and conversation today. And the reason is that you bring such a wide variety to this experience of grief as an entrepreneur. So Neil's bio will be posted below along with his headshot, just like we always do, and links. So Neil helps experts become the face of a movement. He works with executives, influencers, and thought leaders and has helped them get six-figure book advances. Be seen on shows like Ellen and Dr. Oz and double their speaking fees. And I can attest to his expertise because I've taken advantage of it myself as an entrepreneur. Prior to becoming a communications expert, Neil worked on the editorial staff of Penguin Random House, where he worked with New York Times bestselling authors. And he's been featured on Forbes, Fortune, Inc.com, and NBC Palm Springs, and has been a VIP contributor for Entrepreneur. So, Neil, it's just such a joy to have you here today. And I am curious, as you heard that bio of yours reflected back to you, what came up that you'd like to highlight for our audience?
Oh, I appreciate that question, Georgena, because it's kind of funny just sitting and listening to that. That's an accumulation of experiences and milestones over quite a long time. And the truth is that as what my bio says is a communication expert, it's kind of funny that my path toward that was not defined by a proficiency in communication from the beginning, but rather a lack of proficiency. And as evidenced by a deteriorating reading comprehension when I was younger. I started off having really high reading comprehension and language skills in like first grade, where I was in the 99th percentile. And then these things were tracked and tested year over year in my elementary school experience. And by seventh grade, I went from the 99th percentile down to the 54th percentile.
Whoa.
And then by sophomore year of high school, I took the SATs, which is admittedly a little early to take the SATs. But the first time I took them that year, I got a 330 verbal score, which put me in the 5th percentile. And eventually I got it higher than that by the time I graduated from high school, thankfully. But it was an uphill battle to reclaim that capacity to relate to language. And even to this day, reading is not such an easy thing. My girlfriend, who is from a former Soviet country, wanted me to read Alexander Pushkin's stories. And it was his very famous story, The Queen of Spades. And I sat down and read it last night. And it took me a while just to figure out where I was at on the page with this story. It's hard for me to get into fiction in that regard. But I did, and I finished the story. Anyway, all of that's to say that by the time I graduated from college, my brain was mostly mush. I had started to read a couple of light novels in the second half of college. And when I moved to New York City right after graduating, I needed some kind of escape from the subway. And thankfully, this is before smartphones, because that would have been a very easy escape. So I started reading, and I read a book the 6 months following graduation, from about June or July until January of the following year. And it's this novel called A Prayer for Owen Meany by John Irving, and which, interestingly enough, has a lot to do with loss and grief, but also belief and faith and all of these things. And it so completely shattered my worldview, because things don't really work out for the main character like one would want to. I had a very Hollywood sense of how things ended, that it just destroyed me. And I went through this very 20-something angsty, what's it all mean? I don't think there's any meaning or purpose to life kind of experience and phase lasting years. But concurrent to that, I also was so taken with how a book, how the written language, how language period could so profoundly impact me, that I just read everything I could find by John Irving, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff, analyzing it, figuring it out. And that's what got me a job as an editorial assistant at Penguin. And then I didn't go very far. I made it to assistant editor, and then I was like, corporate's not for me, and I went out on my own after only a few years. However, the journey started with that, and it was the analyzing and the figuring things out that laid the groundwork for the skills I now have today.
So what I really, really appreciate is you highlighting the power of the written word to shift you, not only your thinking, but your being.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that's why so many of us write the powerful stories we do, because that allows others to say, oh, yes, here I am in this story, or here I am not. And then that's why we have this podcast and YouTube series, so people who are grieving can say, oh, yes, I see myself there, or no, I don't. Because what's so interesting to me is that you're one of the people who makes their living, and I'm not even sure I like that phrase, who creates their livelihood. That's a better phrase.
Sure.
As an entrepreneur. And so tell us where you were in your entrepreneurial state as a communication expert when the major grief of your father's death occurred, and give us the dates, please. Okay.
Of course. I left Penguin in 2007, in August of 2007, and struggled as a freelancer. Even when I got books, like I was ghostwriting books that, as my bio said, were seen on Ellen and Dr. Oz and all of that. And I did all of these things, but it wasn't until September of 2015 that I had a thought that I could actively take on the marketing. I was struggling so much that by 2014, I was moonlighting driving for Lyft, because I didn't know how to market myself. I didn't know how to attract people to my work. And admittedly, I'm still growing up in my capacity. And it continued on. And then in 2015, I invested in this marketing program. And I'd like to say that it just suddenly changed everything. It had kind of break-even success for maybe the 6 months following my doing the program, but it wasn't a runaway success. And 2016 into 2017, I still had to drive for Lyft. I tried other marketing programs, but then in August of 2017, I was driving for Lyft. I had been working a bit on revisiting that first marketing program from 2015, and I had bit by bit been doing a little bit of the work and also driving. And then I had this horrible experience. I was living in LA at the time, and I had this horrible experience dropping a couple of women off at the Hollywood Bowl. And I was stuck in gridlock traffic getting out of the Hollywood Bowl, which is just the worst gridlock kind of thing when there's a show there. And it was Friday night. I was trying to drive again because Friday night is a good time to drive. And I couldn't get out of there for 20, 30 minutes. And once I finally got out, I was fed up. I turned off my meter. I went home and I ordered some takeout. I took the weekend off, and And I just started working on my marketing full time that following Monday. And then within a month, by the end of September of 2017, started instantly getting leads and instantly started having conversations and figured out how to charge for it with very little confidence. It was very little money compared to what I would eventually be working with. However, it was certainly much more than Lyft. I started making 5-figure months by that October. And that got me the momentum. It was because I shifted away from trying to help to solve book problems like I was in 2015 and started helping to solve public speaking problems in 2017. And that was gangbusters. And I kept doing it and working on different ways I moved away from working with clients full time and started working with information products like courses. And that took off starting slowly in 2018, at the end of 2018. And then 2019, I was doing really well. I started scaling my ads. It just kept working. And I took a little bit of a break. I was going to take a little bit of break in the holiday season of 2019, which is my low season.
Mm-hmm.
And it was November 10th. I remember this. I was just walking by a hotel room that I stayed in on November 6th, 2019, because I was at a PR conference here in New York City. I traveled from LA, and I had this conversation with my father that was really important and very powerful, which of course I can get into. But just to complete the timeline, I had that conversation with him on a Wednesday night. He was in the hospital and he would pass away the following Sunday. And I happened to be on the East Coast when it happened because he's based out of New York area as well. And so I went and was with him in the hospital the day after the conference was over. And he passed away a couple of days later on November 10th. And we can, of course, unpack all of this, but to speak to the entrepreneurial side of things, I did what I had to do, went back home within about a week of his passing, and then threw myself into my work. There was definitely some working through and experiencing of catharsis in those following weeks, because I certainly wasn't ready to grieve and release while I was making funeral arrangements. I was the only one in my family who had any capacity to do anything. And so I took care of everything and then left and had some release and all of that. But what was more significant, Georgena, was that I threw myself into my work, because while the holiday season is the low season, January and the new year, new you kind of thing is very much my high season. And so I threw myself into my work to build out marketing funnels that were going to be launched and utilized starting in the new year, and otherwise figured out how to position myself. And it worked, because January and February of 2020 were the best, most momentous months of my business ever. And we know what happens with the public speaking in March of 2020.
Yes, absolutely.
But that's the basic timeline of how losing my father played into the entrepreneurial context of my momentum and what was happening, and how things would then take shape in 2020, which of course is the main event of my own bereavement and all of
Exactly. And it's so interesting that it was gridlock that brought you to that place of saying no more.
Yes.
And for many of us, grief is that gridlock. And for others, it can be, but so many of us watching and listening have come to that place. So it's very interesting, because what I heard as you shared this is that you had the momentum, and that at different points in time, you followed that momentum. And like so many people who have that initial loss, you took care of everything, and then you threw yourself in to work.
Yep.
And it's so interesting to hear that from so many people.
Yeah.
And yet, what I'm aware of is I'm aware of the richness, literally, of being so well positioned in January and February with the programs that you had. And then I observed you shift so well to online things.
Yes, I was already doing a lot of online work and working remotely with clients and all of that. And so the delivery model of my work didn't really change. I think I started doing more Zoom in 2020, whereas even as recently as 2019, Zoom was around, but I wasn't using it I was doing more phone calls at that point.
Yes.
So there was a shift on some basic granular level. And the more profound and significant thing was the perceived need for how I was positioning myself. Even though what I do isn't really about public speaking, it's about something beneath the surface of public speaking. That happens to be the best way for me to drive interest in how I can help people, as far as I can tell so far.
So let's pick up the thread of the timeline.
Yes.
So January and February were wonderful. We all know what happened to us in March of 2020. When did your grief come up to get your attention so you could no longer just work?
I believe it was around May. I had been trying things and adapting my marketing to virtual stuff and having a little bit of success with it in the couple of months that followed. And I was even looking like I might have a bit of momentum again because my ads were working well at the very end of May. And what also happened at that time was the murdering of George Floyd. And to pour even more salt on the wound, the ad that I had created about a week before George Floyd's murder was, I like to create these very arresting images in my Facebook ads. And I created these big red poster board letters that said virtual. Like, it was this big long thing that was about 4 feet long. And I lied across this cabinet that I had in my bedroom, in one of my bedrooms. And I just put the letters across me, like I was lying face down on the cabinet, staring at the camera. And I put the letters there that said virtual. And I started making sales with that ad because it was just such an outlandish visual that it got people's attention. And the headline was like, "Are you feeling bogged down by switching to virtual presentation?" Something like that, right? Something that was very literal to the image. And it was a Wednesday or Tuesday that someone left a comment. Was like, "I know you don't mean anything by this, but this might not be an appropriate ad." And I was like, "What?" Okay. And then the following Wednesday, the next day, someone said something very similar. It's like, and I realized what they were talking about. The I in virtual was pressing down on my neck.
Whoa.
And they were talking about how inappropriate it was to have this as a visual in the aftermath of his murder, which was on a Monday. And by that weekend, of course, was all the looting and the protests and feeling very unsafe and all of that. And that was what cracked me.
Oh.
That was, so actually it was June, not May, that I started to feel, because any hope I had for that year to actually reposition myself, I couldn't even do ads anymore after that. I didn't start doing Facebook ads in earnest until November of 2022. I tried very small things, but I couldn't even do it. I just had no capacity to put myself out there in that way. And so that was the unfurling of that. I still was clinging on to, I could still make this work. And then in the aftermath of his murder and the way everything seemed to shift, at least in my experience of everything.
Yes.
Everything seemed to shift. And that was just when I couldn't put my grief on hold anymore. And it just started pouring out of me.
Yes. And I really appreciate that image. I couldn't put my grief on hold anymore.
Yeah.
Because that happens with so many people. It's on hold, it's on hold. I'll get to you. I really don't want to, but you'll get your time. However, for you, it erupted, is what my feeling is. Did I get it?
Yes, because I remember in the next couple of months, as with grief, it wasn't a linear thing. It wasn't like a super amount of intense catharsis. For me, it was catharsis through crying. And it wasn't just a lot of crying in June and then a bit less in July and then a bit less in August. It was an intense amount of crying on a certain day and then nothing for a week or two or whatever it was. But I remember there was one day where I broke down crying 4 times in a single day. And there was a week where I had 5 or 6 different episodes. And it was all within those few months in that first part of the second half of 2020. It was just so much and so intense, and definitely not a linear experience. I was just walking from one room to another, and then all of a sudden I collapsed on the floor in the hallway between the rooms. I couldn't even wait. I couldn't bring myself to the couch or to the bedroom. I was just right there in the middle of the apartment. Yeah. Yeah.
And at what point then did you seek someone to companion you in your grief?
What's interesting is I was already seeing a therapist before my father passed away. And we went right into the protocol contained within the Grief Recovery Handbook. And so she partnered with me immediately. It included me reading that book and doing some of the preliminary exercises. And one of the things they also have you do is a timeline of you and the person you lost. But what she had me do first, before those experiences, I first did a couple of timelines of other people just to get acclimated to the process. And then I did it for my father. And so that all happened before, I would say, before even the pandemic started. I think that all happened within those 5 months. So it was a lot because I was also doing all of this work and everything.
Yes.
And so on one level, it seems like I thought he said he put his grief on hold. I still did, because while I was going through those motions, I wasn't feeling on a particularly deep level. I started to, like I said, I had a couple of moments in those weeks following his passing after I got back home with some kind of release here or there. And I was doing this protocol, but the avalanche, the tsunami of grief really happened in the second half of 2020.
Yes. So how interesting it is that you had those tools, you actually showed up, and that book, which is so powerful, I respect these men so much that put it together. It was a book that was useful, and the state that you were in, it wasn't that immediate impact.
Right. And I really like the protocol. And I also believe that the more somatically driven or conscious work that you do is just as important and arguably even more foundational to the thing, because there was an intellectualization of so much of it in that particular process. And my default setting, as a result of what exactly I described, when I read the John Irving book and all that, I intellectualized everything.
Yes.
I figured out a puzzle and spent decades in that highly intellectualized state. And it wasn't until grieving my father that it cracked open. I barely had the capacity to cry before my father. Before my father passed away, even though I was the class crier in elementary school. But I locked that down by 12 or 13 because it wasn't safe to cry anymore. And it really wasn't. It really wasn't. There's stories in my 6th grade experience in particular where crying led me into a world of hell and exposed me to a lot of bullying. And so I unlearned that, and I unlearned it well. And so having that broke it open. So I had a cathartic experience just 2 days ago.
Oh, tell us more.
Well, I had a day-long therapy immersion that was assisted by a psychoactive substance, which I believe in very wholeheartedly because it helps to break some things down. And especially for me as a more intellectual state, the psychoactive substances help me to be more in my body and to feel without telling as much of a story about it, just allowing it to happen. And I've done this particular protocol, I believe, 8 times before. This, I think, was my 9th time, or maybe it was my 10th. And I have had cathartic releases several days after the process and other kinds of release. However, this was the very first time that I released in the session itself. And it was soon after administering the substance. It wasn't actually at the height of the influence. I think I was just holding on to something for weeks that just was ready to come out, and just giving myself the day and receiving the attention of a therapist was enough to help me feel safe enough to let it go. That's what I figure, at the very least.
And it's so interesting to me because I appreciate what I'm hearing is that initially you didn't allow for the navigating the ocean of emotion because there wasn't that, because you'd gotten so good at shutting down emotion when you were in 6th grade.
Right.
And there were times that the emotion came up and you just couldn't do anything more but be with it.
Right.
But yet the grief was bringing up the deepest, darkest parts of yourselves, longing to be heard and healed. And that's what you've been working in and as.
Absolutely. It's the sort of thing where if I would look at the second half of my life as the life that I want for myself, if I can allow myself to feel in the way that is true to who I am, is an authentic expression of whatever comes up. Because when we all remember that kid, I mean, I happen to be that kid, so of course I remember, but there's always that one kid who cried a lot. And as that child, I didn't stop being sensitive. I didn't stop being prone to being affected by things with a greater intensity, perhaps, than others are. But what I wasn't doing was allowing myself to be in that. And I very much like to honor that part of myself as I continue to grow up, which is a funny thing to say at 47, but yeah, I absolutely look at the rest of my life as an opportunity to continue growing up, which is really, in my mind, Georgena, is that I'm really nuts for this construct that's supported by this company down in South Africa called Aphoria, and they have this identity maturation framework. And they look at our journey as just a gradual maturing. And I just look at that moment of, not moment, but series of moments of losing my father and processing the grief as what probably led me to the next stage of maturity.
Exactly.
That I'm able to return to that sense of feeling again.
Because the Integrated Wellbeing Institute's new paradigm of grief
Mm.
is that you're not broken by this loss. You're broken open like a seed to root down into self-awareness and new connections. And that's a spiral upward. And that's that maturation. Believe it or not, we're all going to be maturing if we choose until the
Yeah.
day we leave the planet. And you
Yes.
heard how I phrased that, Neil.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I honor the fact that you have the awareness that says, hey, I want to keep doing this. I want to see who I am evolving to next, bringing that part of me, honoring that part of me from the past
Yeah.
as we make this journey.
Yes.
I met with a group of mothers last night whose children have all died of suicide. And what I heard was what so many people in grief struggle with is, if I move on, and I quickly worded that to when I take a step forward to be happy to do
Sure.
something, am I abandoning them? And I said, no, they come with you. I, I can assure you that you have the choice to bring them with you.
Hmm.
And so thank you so much for sharing this continual growth.
Hmm.
And as I'm sure, or I'm imagining, excuse me, not sure, that you have other griefs in your life now that you are navigating
Yeah,
or looking at.
absolutely. And that was very much apparent when I set out to have this session just a couple of days ago too. And I'm dealing more with a sense of loss around aspects of my relationship with my mother, who is still alive, but there was a certain point in my life, in my very young life, where it felt like she was less available. And she was physically present, but maybe less emotionally so. And that is turning out to be a rather significant aspect of my journey. And
Mm-hmm.
so I am now in what one might call a grief recovery around that particular loss. But admittedly, it feels, at least for me, a lot more nuanced and a lot if grieving is nonlinear in general, this process and protocol feels particularly nonlinear as well. So it's probably going to take some time for me to work that part of myself out.
Mm-hmm. Now, I heard you say that you are intellectualized, or you're a thinker like I
Mm,
am.
yeah.
And then to get down into the body is a gift. It brings
Mm,
us into that wholeness. However, I'm very, very curious. How do you, as an entrepreneur
mm-hmm,
who is working and providing such wonderful service to so many people who
mm,
want their message out there as a
yeah.
movement, how do you then, I'm going to use, I don't know what word to use, how do you navigate, that's the word I'll choose,
Mm,
between work and the emotion? What keeps you focused on being the entrepreneur and yet allowing you to do the work? Do you set aside a time each day to do this
mm.
process work as a spiritual practice or a meditation time? Do you compartmentalize like our most recent speaker said she does? How do you do this? Tell us more.
What I would say, Georgina, is that I'm aspiring to break down as many of those walls as I can in how I navigate the world, which I don't know necessarily what that might look like. And I imagine some compartmentalization will likely always be of value, just especially with strangers. If I'm breaking down
Sure.
crying in the middle of a session, then that
That's right, Neil.
that might not be particularly productive.
Maybe not.
However,
Mm-hmm.
what one thing I've been doing some Alexander technique sessions with
Great.
with a practitioner of that discipline, especially
Mm-hmm.
when I'm talking about subtle and nuanced.
Yes,
And
that's right. Mm-hmm.
I have had a couple of small breakthroughs in terms of what I feel I need to do to activate more of a body aware, more somatic experience. And it could just be, I tend to raise my chin up a little bit like this. There's a clenching or an armoring up that happens just by raising my head up a little. But if I just do this, it's very subtle. If you and for people who are just listening and not seeing it, just know that all I did was just very, very subtly lowered my chin a tiny bit. That's all that happened right there, if you're only listening to this. And all of that's to say that I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to program into my reminder sequence. I have a software I use that has reminders come up in my email inbox. And I'm going to do somewhere in the middle of the day, I'm going to say, hey, adjust your chin. And that's going to be, it's intended to be at least a combination of that just physical practice. And a thing that also came up in my session on Saturday is cultivating a greater sense of wonder and a greater sense of presence, not relying on the dopamine hit of looking at my phone every other second to see if I got another email or another this or another that, whatever it is. Yes. And just working on that presence, that becomes a small way, for now at least, to start bringing myself back into my body a bit. And in terms of the intellectualization and being more in my body type of work, one other thing that I've been working on for almost as long as I've been doing this substance assisted therapy, so a couple of years now, or a couple of years, I would say, is I've been incorporating something into my work more and more, especially for my retainer clients, called the high functioning playground. And what that is, my work is often very time-based. It's like, all right, we're going to do this in about 6 or 7 hours, that sort of thing. And I'm trying to move away from that more and more. Sometimes I just have a very results-oriented, very linear, here's what we're going to do, and this is what gets us to the successful outcome that we want kind of work, even if it's not time-based. And what I'm trying to do more of is just start a session without an attachment to a very specific outcome and see where things take us. Have a discussion. Maybe my client talks about something random. Maybe I talk about something random, but some sort of dot might just get connected organically, and just to allow that to happen. And that requires me to be a bit more in my body and a bit more present instead of thinking things out and figuring things out so much. So it all feels related to me, at least.
Yes. And Neil, I see that as what this conversation has been.
Yes.
Okay. Connecting the dots, listening to one another, because I became so excited when you said you're in exploring the Alexander work.
Yes.
Because that's part of Alana's work. That's part of the Rubenfeld synergy, Feldenkrais and Alexander. And what I already heard and observed with your shifting your chin down slightly is that self-awareness of, oh, when my chin is up, I feel armored and I'm feeling my jaw clenching. All I have to do is just lower my chin.
Yes.
And listen to the metaphor to go from up to neutral. And how many times do we get up there and we're, and then just to come back into our body and be in that natural state of being is just absolutely so amazing. So and I love the fact that you're using the word playground with your clients, because that's what we all need more of, is less doing, more being, less work, and more play.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. The research and many of my clients who are experts in this all seem to point back to playing and having some fun puts us into a state that makes us more creative, makes us more productive, and yet we have a culture. I will not mince words around how much I disapprove of the way our culture creates an educational experience for children. I will absolutely go on the record as saying that the entire thing is tragic And if we thought more about how to activate not just a sense of play, but a sense of curiosity and
Yes.
exploration and a willingness to be quote unquote wrong and not considered a failure if we do something quote unquote wrong,
Hmm.
that we are just going to achieve so much more, and frankly, just in my opinion, have a much more enjoyable life.
Exactly. Yes, Neil. And it's so neat that you talked about the word wonder, because one of the things that is on my website is an
Yeah.
acronym for WOW, and
Mm,
it's willingness, openness, wonder.
yes.
And then that goes with the curiosity that you talked about.
Mhm.
That goes with the discovery. And that's the thing, is when we have had a significant loss that puts us in that vortex of grief and it feels so dark, it's so important to remember who we are, that we still have the capacity. It may not be immediate or even in our awareness, but we still have that capacity to be willing and open, because the world is full of wonder.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. It just winds up being a powerful way to tune in with the life that surrounds us and that we are in.
Mm-hmm. It does indeed. It does indeed. So I am so grateful to you, Neil, for your authenticity, vulnerability, and wisdom, as well as your presence. This has been amazing. So, as we come to the end of our conversation, I'm wondering, what would you like to say and leave with uh, for our audience? What would you like to say to them and leave with them?
Early on in our discussion, Georgina, I mentioned and just sort of glossed over how the Wednesday before I lost my father, I was in a hotel room in New York City talking to him while he was in the hospital.
Yes.
And I mentioned how there was a significant conversation that was had from that. And earlier that day, I had been at the conference and had navigated all of these conversations with these strangers, coming out of it thinking, oh, my dad would be really proud of me for the way I showed up today. And then I wondered why I suddenly thought that. There was the wonder. And I realized that afternoon, later that day, why. I had spent most of the day listening to other people and what was important to them. And I was curious about their world with very little. It's kind of funny. Whenever I'm on a podcast like this, it's really funny that I'm doing so much of the talking, because that tends to be the opposite of how I like to show up in my conversations.
I know that.
So I thought about it and I reflected on it. And then by the time I spoke to my dad that night, I told him the story of when I was 18 and my parents and I and my siblings all went to a family friend's house for a party of some kind. And that night, I had had a lot of conversations with people, mostly the adults, mostly the older generation. My parents' generation were there. And I had had a lot of conversations. And this felt good to me because it was in contrast to how glum and morose and withdrawn I was as a 14, 15-year-old boy, which so many of us are. And I felt good about that. But then my dad made an observation to me that night after we got home. He said, son, every time I overheard you in a conversation tonight, you were doing all of the talking. And that was like a gut punch. Now, he wasn't aggressive with it and he wasn't accusatory. He just made the observation. And I didn't realize until that Wednesday night, a few days before he passed away, that that was the origin story of everything I strive to teach others in my work. You introduced me as a communication expert. And if I was to distill all of that expertise down to one idea, it's that effective communication values the recipient over the sender. And that idea, I didn't have a way to articulate that to myself at 18, and it would take years before I was able to say that.
Yes.
to myself and articulate that. But it began that night when I realized I didn't want to be a person who used other people in his interactions and used communication as a way to gratify my senses. I wanted to use it as a form of service, and eventually and strove to teach others that. And so I wanted to leave our listeners and viewers with just my simple gratitude that A, my father said that to me and helped me to find this path, and B, that I was able to think of that before I actually lost him and it was too late to say that and tell them that story.
Thank you, Neil. Before it was too late to tell him that story. And that is so heart-opening for me to hear you say that, because there are so many people, Neil, who are struggling because they didn't say what was in their heart to the person that is no longer here in person. And oh yes, they write letters and they burn letters and all kinds of things with letters. And you had the opportunity, and you, Neil, took the opportunity to share that profound experience with your father. I cannot thank you enough for being here today. I'm so grateful for all that we explored. And once again, your presence is such a gift. So thank you very, very much. And I'll look forward to seeing what comments we have as a result of this interview, because I have enjoyed it immensely. Thank you very, very much.
I did as well, Georgena. Thank you so much as well.
You're welcome. Take deep care.